Good evening, everybody. We are working on Chapter 68 in A Child's History of the World. We are going to be reading about, it looks like, Queen Elizabeth tonight. I apologize that we haven't recorded much lately. We were out of town during spring break and just now getting back to catching up. Okay, so Queen Elizabeth, Chapter 68. King Henry VIII had two daughters, one named Mary and another was named Elizabeth. Excuse me, lots of yawning, end of the day. Their last name was, of course, Tudor, the same as their father's, although we don't usually think of kings and queens as having last names. I mean, normally we just think Henry VIII or, just based on their number, not necessarily that they have last names. So, King Henry had a son also, and he was first to become king after his father died. For though he was younger than his sisters, a boy was supposed to be a much more fit ruler than a girl. But he didn't live long, and then Mary was the first of the two sisters to become queen. Mary did not approve what her father had done when he turned against the Pope and the Catholic Church. Mary herself was a strong Catholic and ready to fight for the Pope and the Catholic Church. She thought that all those who did not believe as she did should be persecuted for heresy or expressing beliefs opposed to the traditional Catholic Church. Okay, like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, she was always saying, "Off with his head." This seemed to be very unchristian, especially to us. But in those days, their ideas about such things were different. Mary had so many people killed that she was nicknamed Bloody Mary. Mary married a man who was just as strong a Catholic as she, and even bloodier. He was not an Englishman, but a Spaniard, Philip II of Spain, son of Charles V, who had abdicated the throne. Philip II was much sterner, that doesn't sound like a great word, much more stern than his father had been. Philip tried to make those who were Protestant, or who were supposed to be Protestant, confess and give up Protestantism. If they did not do so, they were tortured as the old Christian martyrs had been tortured. This was called the Inquisition. Those suspected of being Protestants were tormented in all sorts of horrible ways. Some were tied up in the air by their hands, like a picture hung on a wall, until they fainted from the pain, or else confessed what they were told to confess. Some were stretched on a rack, their heads pulled one way, and their legs the opposite way, until their bodies were nearly torn apart. Those who were found guilty of being Protestants were killed outright, burned to death, or put slowly to death, so that they would suffer longer. You should know that Protestants were not the only people who suffered under the Spanish Inquisition. A century earlier, Jews were tortured in the same way. Most left Spain to find new homes in North Africa or Europe. The people whom Philip chiefly persecuted were the Dutch people in Holland. Holland then belonged to his empire, and a great many of the Dutch people had become Protestants. Excuse me. Now, there was a Dutchman called William the Silent, because he talked little but did a great deal. William was furious at the way his people were treated. He fought against Philip and at last succeeded in making his country free and setting up the Dutch Republic. But William the Silent was murdered by order of Philip. And that's the kind of man Bloody Mary had for a husband. And that's, after Mary Tudor died, her sister, Elizabeth Tudor, became queen. Elizabeth was the strongest of Henry's 3 children. Elizabeth had red hair and was very vain and loved to be flattered. Many men loved her, but she never married. And as a woman who never marries was called a virgin, she was known as the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth was a Protestant and was just as bitter against the Catholics as her sister and her sister's husband had been against the Protestants. A relative of Elizabeth was Queen of Scotland. Scotland is a country north of England, but at the time it did not have the same ruler as England, and its queen was named Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was young, beautiful, and fascinating, but she was a Catholic, and so Elizabeth and she were enemies. Elizabeth heard that Mary Stuart was trying to become Queen of England as well as Scotland, so she had her, although a relative, put in prison. In prison, Mary Stuart stayed for nearly 20 years and was then at last put to death by Elizabeth's order. It is hard for us to understand how anyone could have their own relative killed in this cold-blooded way, especially one who pretended to be a Christian. But in those times, it was a very common custom, as we see when we hear of so many murders committed by the rulers of the people. Philip II, the great champion of the Catholics, made up his mind to punish Elizabeth, his sister-in-law, for killing such a good Catholic as Mary Stuart. So he got together a large navy of very fine ships called the Spanish Armada. All Spain was very proud of this fleet. It was boastfully called the Invincible Armada. Invincible means that it's not able to be conquered. We'll see how that goes. The Invincible Armada set forth in 1588 to conquer the English navy. Lined up in the shape of a half moon, the ships sailed gradually towards England. The English fleet was composed of little boats only. Instead of going out to meet the Armada in regular sea battle, as the Spanish expected, the English ships sailed out and attacked the Spanish ships from behind and fought one ship at a time. The English were better fighters, and their smaller boats were quicker and more easily managed. They could strike a blow and get away before a Spanish ship could turn around into position to fire. Gradually, the English fleet sank or destroyed the big Spanish boats one by one. Then the English set some old boats afire and started them drifting towards the Spanish fleet. As all boats at that time were, of course, made of wood, the Spanish became frightened at these burning piles drifting down upon them, and part of the fleet sailed away. The rest tried to get back to Spain by sailing the long way around north of Scotland. However, a terrible storm struck them, and almost all the boats were shipwrecked, and thousands of dead bodies were washed up on shore. However, the great Spanish Armada was destroyed, and with it ended the power of Spain at sea. Spain was no longer the great nation it had been. At the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, the largest and most powerful country in the world was Spain. At the end of her reign, it was England that was the most powerful. Her fleet, which King Alfred had started far back, became one of the largest. People at that time thought it impossible for a woman to rule as well as a man, but under Elizabeth's rule, England in turn became the leading country in Europe. Elizabeth proved that a woman could rule England better than most kings had. All right, that is it for chapter 68. We'll get started on 69 here soon. Ta-ta.